Hey everyone, usually I talk about Fire Emblem, but today I want to talk about something different. I hope you don't mind. I want to talk about the Harry Potter series, because I've mentioned this before when I was playing with Mangs. We were doing another one of those FE9 Maniac Mode maps that take forever and nothing a whole lot to talk about, so I just started talking about Harry Potter and why I like it so much. And I felt like it deserves its own video, because Harry Potter is just a really big part of who I am and what I grew up with, really, because it's arguably just as big as Fire Emblem. It's definitely a bigger part of my childhood than Fire Emblem was, because I only discovered Fire Emblem when I was like, I think it's like high school, so like 12, 13, 14 maybe. Harry Potter came before that, Pokemon came before that, of course, but Fire Emblem, like, it's big now for me, but it wasn't back then. Harry Potter is what I grew up with, and it's just a series that I keep coming back to it, even now, even like 20 years later after the release of the first part, Philosopher's Stone. That's like 1997, it's like 2018 right now, so that's 21 years ago. And I still can't put these, I kind of put these books down. I couldn't if you like forced me to. It's like, they're just so fun to read. Even though I know like every letter by heart, I know every little part of every story, I still can't help but notice like new details or new stuff in it. It's just one of the most rich worlds I've ever seen in fiction, and it really got me, I wouldn't say it got me into reading. I'll tell you how I like got into it, I guess. So I think when I was in like one of my last years of primary school, my teacher read the Philosopher's Stone to the class. He didn't finish it because the books are super long and you rarely finish a book as a teacher. But I was interested, I think, and then at some point I got into the second part, the Chamber of Secrets. I read that one on my own. These were the translated versions, the Dutch versions. I think it would have been pretty hard to get the English ones, but at that age I didn't really have the skill to read English at that high of a level. I was like 10 at most back then, so it's pretty logical to read them in your translated language, and they did a pretty good job. Some of the name changes are ridiculous, but at that age you don't really notice. So I started reading them, and at some point I caught up, right? I was out of, Dutch books, but there was the English version of Order of the Phoenix. And Order of the Phoenix is probably what you owe the Mekkah of today to when it comes to English skills. I realized this the other day. I was like, if I hadn't started reading Order of the Phoenix when I was bored on summer vacation, I was like camping with my family, had nothing to do. So I just started reading Harry Potter in English because I was curious about what was going to happen next, and I didn't want to wait for the Dutch version. And boy, that was pretty hard, because English is pretty hard when you don't read it a whole lot. I had played some video games, but like a lot of the words I just didn't know what they meant. But through a lot of figuring out and like checking the contexts, there was no way to look it up right back then. There was no like wide use of cell phones. I didn't really have a phone back then, even not one that could access the internet anyway. So it was just me going through this book and trying to understand everything that happened, which worked pretty well. And at that point, there was no stopping, right? I had to know what happened next, because after the first 4 or 5 books, the plot really heats up and you really want to know how it's going to end. So I ended up picking up Half-Blood Prince, or rather my parents did, when it came out, of course, and I of course got the Deathly Hallows on the night it was released, and I read it within 24 hours. I was never like a Potter fanatic in the way that I would like dress up, go to conventions, or celebrate Harry Potter parties, or roleplay it with my friends, or I didn't even really take part in any kind of fandom on the internet. Even when I was actually on the internet, I went on some discussion boards, but very briefly. It wasn't as big for me as like Pokemon or Fire Emblem again. But I was definitely entrenched in the world. I definitely knew Harry Potter pretty well by heart. It was just a very interesting franchise to me. And Deathly Hallows, I really wanted to know how it ended. I remember sitting on the couch and reading for like hours and hours straight, wanted to know how it went, because Deathly Hallows has no breaks really. It has like a slow part, the part where they're like camping out in the woods when nothing is really happening and you're just lonely. It's just setting the grim mood for the book. Be like, they have like no clues on where to go and how to beat Voldemort, so they just kind of sit around and try to stay alive. That's kind of a slow part, but everything else is like super heat and intense and like full packed of action. But it's a good kind of action, when people think of action, they usually think of like movies and things happening from scene to scene. But action works pretty well in books for me, as long as it's written properly. And J.K. Rowling she managed to create a really amazing world that like lets your fantasy loose. Basically, she tells just enough detail for me to get it right. You've probably read some books somewhere where the writer tries to describe like every single thing ever on a scene with like great detail, and it just bores me to tears. Like, for example, Dan Brown. I have a couple of those books. They're like, I don't like them as much anymore because now I've analyzed them, so I've kind of ruined them for myself. But they're just, there's too much detail in there. It's, you kind of want to skip over most of that if you're not a history buff. So yeah, no, that's too much. And there's also too little where you just don't know anything, and the writer just doesn't describe anything. That's also shitty writing. J.K. Rowling is like right in the middle for me. She's like pretty perfect at that kind of stuff, at least in Harry Potter. I haven't read any of her other work. There's a lot you could say about J.K. Rowling's writing. I've actually seen some analysis on the internet that is actually pretty bad in some parts. Honestly, the prose is also kind of repetitive, which I'm starting to notice. It's kind of annoying. Something like, I think Harry's stomach turned over has been used like 20,000 times in Chamber of Secrets or something. That stuff is annoying, but for the most part, I think her writing is fine and good enough to enjoy for a children's book, and as an adult I can still, you know, appreciate it just enough. It's fun to read. But what I really like about the Harry Potter books, though, my favorite part absolutely, are the characters. When people ask me like to pick my favorite character, I honestly can't. I think there's a lot of characters that I just enjoy in a way. I mean, two of my favorites have to be Harry and Hermione. And I think the fact that she managed to create a very likable main character that is still very flawed is very cool. It's easy to have a main character that's just a self-insert, you know, ask Fire Emblem, or, you know, ask Twilight or something. The main characters of those are liked by the fans, but mostly because people can easily see themselves in them because they're so bland and so boring. Harry is very different. Harry is very different from me in a lot of aspects, you know. He's got a bit of a temper. He's a dumb teenager, which I was, to be honest. That's pretty accurate. But he's lost his parents. I still have got my parents, but I still find him easy to connect to and live along with and understand him. Maybe not as much as a teenager. I think back then sometimes I was like, why is Harry being so edgy in Order of the Phoenix? But, you know, the guy lost his parents. The guy had his arch nemesis get resurrected. He's probably traumatized at this point with all he's gone through. He loses several parent figures during his puberty. And of course, he's like the equivalent of a teen celebrity in a world that he doesn't know as much about as his peers do. And he finds out that being a celebrity isn't all that fun, especially when everything turns against you. He like learns how annoying it is when people write bullshit about you. That kind of stuff really annoys him, and you know, it should. He has all the right to be angry, and that's great. That's I don't know. I really like what she's done with Harry. Yeah. I never thought about this much because I always felt like Harry was just a person from whose perspective we're seeing Harry Potter, and that's pretty much it. But he's so much more than that. The way Harry reacts to the world around him is interesting. The way he interacts with things, the way he handles things. He clearly has his own moral code on how to do stuff. He is righteous in a way. He's not afraid to tell people that, you know, he's like most people would probably be a bit too scared to talk the way Harry does to some authority figures, such as teachers, think like Umbridge, think people from the Ministry, but he just does it. He has the guts to do it, and it's very believable that he does because he's just so tired of their shit, and I love it. Hermione, also one of my favorite characters. Part of this is Emma Watson's appeal in the movies, of course, but Hermione herself is just a wonderfully written character. A lot of the times, people like to write certain characters, guys or girls, doesn't matter, that are smarter than everyone else and they end up being a bit of a nerd. You know, there's like a trope of like a guy that constantly pushes his glasses up his nose, and he's like, actually, Hermione's kind of like that character, but not really. She has like, what I like about Hermione is that she's not just smart, but she's also people smart. She also has a lot of social skills. She's clearly developed ahead of everyone around her when it comes to, you know, knowing how girls think, not being a dick to other people. She's what's the word? The house elves, the thing that she does for the house elves, where she's like, we probably shouldn't be enslaving these. That's not okay. And everyone else just kind of looks at her like, huh, that's kind of dumb. Just keep them as slaves. It's useful, and they like it that way. But Hermione's different. Hermione doesn't mind thinking differently. So Hermione's got a mind of her own. She's not just the smartass that knows all the facts. She has that too, but she also becomes more and more considerate about it as the books go on a little bit. She still can't resist the temptation to answer a question, of course, but she still has that. She's book smart and she's people smart, which I think is a good combination. And she's also not even Harry's love interest, which I also think is an interesting angle. She instead goes for Ron. And, you know, I've never liked shipping. Any kind of shipping is just kind of annoys me. I did kind of find it weird that, well, yeah, I guess kind of spoilers if you haven't read the end of the books, but by now you probably should have. I found it kind of weird who Hermione ends up with, but as I reread the series, I realized that there were so many clues in there for the way her love works. And, you know, Ron, a character that I haven't really mentioned here yet, because he was never one of my favorites. But as I look at the way that he treats, for example, Hermione, or even, you know, random other people in especially book 7, I realized that Ron has really learned a lot as a character. In book 5 and 6, or even before that, Ron is a tactless idiot, really. He's kind of a goofball, kind of a dumbass, but he learns the error of his ways, and that's really cool. Another character I really like is Dumbledore. I feel like my favorite part about Dumbledore is the way he talks to people. It's kind of subtle. He's almost always talking some mad trash to people when he has the opportunity, but he does it in a very subtle and likable way. I enjoy that. He's kind of sort of sarcastic. There is no arguing with someone like Dumbledore. He's also smart and powerful and everything, but that's not what I like about him. I like the way he talks, basically. Everyone in Harry Potter has a very distinct voice, the way they talk and the way they do stuff. And Dumbledore, he's got a really cool style of magic. He can do things that no one else can, but it's believable because the book builds him up properly, and he never pretends to be almighty. He acknowledges that he's more powerful than most people, but he is still a very flawed character. He is still fun to, you know... my favorite parts of Dumbledore are probably in Half-Blood Prince, when he has like alone time with Harry, and we really get to see a lot of Dumbledore, basically, because he's usually a teacher that's only around for a couple scenes in the books. Usually he's around for the end a little bit, to have like a concluding talk with Harry about what happened in his confrontation with Voldemort number 20,007. And those are some of my favorite moments, and Half-Blood Prince has a lot more Dumbledore, which is why I like Half-Blood Prince a lot as a book. It's one of my favorites, actually, but then again, it's hard to pick a favorite, really. The one thing about Dumbledore that I don't like is something that's not the fault of the character, but the fault of the writer, really. That's the whole thing about where J.K. Rowling had like a press conference about how he's gay. I thought that was kind of unnecessary, and after the fact, if you wanted to write a good representing gay character, you could have just done it within the books. There's no real evidence that Dumbledore is like gay in the books. I would talk more about this, but honestly, there is a really good video by SarahZ, I think is how you pronounce it, that explains why this is a problem, even for like gay people, why that's probably not the greatest thing. I'll link it in the description. It's about author's intent versus the writer is dead or something. It's a pretty good watch. I would recommend it to anyone. It's a good channel in general. So yeah, Dumbledore is still one of my favorites, though. Like, that kind of stuff doesn't detract from him in any way for me. Snape, I also think is interesting, not because I think he's the best written character ever. I feel like the book treats Snape as if he was completely redeemed by his actions in the last book, or by his tragic backstory. But Snape was really just a bully when you think about it. Just a very socially awkward person that had no real good reason to cling to dark magic the way he did, other than being scared, which is, I don't know, I found it kind of strange. Dumbledore explained to Harry at one point that the people who clung most to Voldemort were the weak seeking protection, or so like people like Wormtail, for example, or I don't know, some other types of people, but none of these archetypes really seemed to fit Snape to me. Snape was just someone, he could actually elude Voldemort, he could actually look in his eyes and lie to him, which I think it showed that Snape was at least in a tier of his own when it comes to magical power and wit, and I don't know, I just felt like being a subordinate to either Voldemort or Dumbledore doesn't really work for him. I feel like he could have done better, and I also don't think he should have been abusing Neville. Like, don't do that. Don't bully Harry either. Like, I thought that was kind of cheap. I don't feel like he was redeemed, really. I still think it was an interesting character and very interesting for speculation before we actually knew his true colors. I will say that much. He was a good... I don't know if I want to say good character. He was an interesting part of the books for sure, but he was not one of my favorite characters. Voldemort, speaking of which, I thought he had some cartoony villain moments there. I was like, really, you're gonna explain your whole plan? But I really like, again, I like the Dumbledore Harry lessons where we see a lot of Voldemort and the way that he works and the way that he ticks. And even though the pensive and like telling backstories is never one of my favorite things to develop a character, I still think Voldemort was, you know, a very, very sufficient villain, very well built up, and his downfall does fit with the way that he's been built up. So I like that much. So those are the characters that I like the most. I guess I shouldn't forget Fred and George. Those are, you know, they're just comic relief characters. They're supporting cast, but they're still really cool. And really well portrayed by the actors in the movies, by the way. They're just, I don't know, it's easy to write a couple funny characters, I feel like. But Fred and George just pull it off so well. It's just their attitude. I can't really explain it in words, which is why the books are so amazing. Because it's like, when you put them all on top of each other, it's like a huge pile of books with just a bunch of moments with each of these characters, and together they combine, they create this huge package. But if you were to ask me what do you like so much about these characters, it's very hard to describe it word for word and be like, I like Fred and George because X and Y. And it's just the total package that does it for me. I do enjoy that they're pretty much responsible for Ron learning how to treat girls, which I think is pretty funny. Fred and George, Dan, so good. So after I finished the books, of course I wanted more, but there's not really more to look at. There's some like post Harry Potter stuff that has been made, but it has never interested me. For me, the franchise is the books. The movies I don't really like that much. They are okay experiences in their own, I guess, but they don't really work for portraying the books. They work as like movies that are based on the books, but not really as like movies that are supposed to tell the story and everything in the books. I think the setting just really only works if you have many pages to describe things and use your own fantasy. The movies are very, very flawed. They skip a lot of stuff, which they have to because they're limited in length, but it just hurts so much. And a lot of important moments are just cut out. Characters are made up on the spot because they've been left out of previous movies because there was no time for them. Like I think her name is Miss Figs or something. She suddenly saves Harry and Dudley from the Dementors in Half-Blood Prince, I think it is. Or no, it's Order of the Phoenix actually. But they didn't. They were supposed to show her in one of the first movies, but they didn't because they were dumb. So that kind of stuff hurts the movies a lot. So not a fan of those. Just the books. If you haven't read the books, read the books because they're just so much fun. Even if you're like 30 or something, just read the books. They're so cool. I wonder though. I want to know actually. If there's anyone who has only seen the movies but they haven't read the books, is there anything in the movies that you find confusing? Because I feel like if you only watch the movies, they look a little bit better because you're not depending on the book anymore. You're just watching a standalone thing. So things that are left out of the movie but are in the books, those don't hurt as much. They don't hurt the movies as much. But at the same time, I can imagine that the movies get very confusing. So let me know down in the comments if you're someone who's only seen the movies and got confused by something that was supposedly explained by the books. But other than that, I think my main thing that I like to do, besides reading the books, of course, is just the lexicon. The Harry Potter lexicon is a really fun resource because the Harry Potter books are like full of information, but it's all laid out in story order. Whereas the lexicon, it basically turns it into a library where you can find anything under any category and just kind of have fun with that. So it's really fun to read, for example, the reader's guide and check for little details that you missed. Or just read up on, like, you can look up everyone who has worked at the Daily Prophet. You can look up any of the teachers, any of the details about them. You can read about a single character and everything they've ever done in the books or in a later canon. And that kind of stuff shows how rich the universe is. When you can make an entire library of information about a book, I think it shows quite a bit of depth. And I don't mean just making a wiki, because you can make a wiki about anything. But this is a solid library of a world. This is... it's basically like you walked into Hogwarts and you look at the book of the history of Hogwarts. That's basically the Harry Potter lexicon in a nutshell. And it's really cool. I don't know if I'm doing it justice, but it's a lot of fun. So yeah, this is easily in my top 3 of favorite franchises ever, even if it's being milked to death now with like movies like The Cursed Child or that play, or whatever they're all called, Fantastic Beasts and where to find them, that kind of stuff. That doesn't really interest me. The books are what it's all about. Read the books. They're so much fun. I don't know. This was just kind of a stream of consciousness kind of thing for me. So I don't know if you like that or not. I know some people watch my stuff, like put it on in the background and do something else. It's like ASMR, I think it's what it's called. So if that was what you're here for, then you got what you wanted, I guess. So have a good day. See you around. Bye.